Hello. Welcome to the Cowboy Heart Stories channel. Tonight, let's listen to a story that begins with loneliness and a choice no one could understand. And perhaps, somewhere in that story, you'll see a reflection of yourself. He won a wife, and the whole town laughed at him. That is how the story was told for years afterward. Usually with a grin, usually over a drink, usually by men who had never known what it meant to lose everything worth living for. They said he should have walked away. They said only a fool would take home a woman no one wanted. They said a man like Caleb Mercer had finally broken under the weight of grief and loneliness. But the truth was not nearly so simple. And it was far more painful than gossip ever allows, because on that cold afternoon, under a sky the color of old iron, Caleb did not believe he was winning anything at all. He believed he was witnessing the final humiliation of another human soul. And somewhere in the silence that followed, in the terrible silence after cruel laughter fades, something inside him that had been dead for years moved again. The town had gathered like people always do when they sense shame is about to become entertainment. Boots crowded the dusty street. Wagon wheels stood still. Faces leaned forward with that hungry look people get when they are relieved that someone else is suffering more than they are. At the center of it all stood a woman in a faded dress, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were trying to disappear inside her own skin. She did not plead. She did not fight. She did not even raise her voice. That may have been the hardest thing to watch. She stood there as if life had already taught her that no one was coming to help, as if hope itself had become too expensive to carry. Some said she was useless. Some said she brought bad luck. Some said she was too quiet, too strange, too damaged to be worth the trouble. By then, the rumors had swallowed her real name so completely that many no longer spoke of her as a person at all. Just a burden, just a mistake, just a thing to be passed from one set of hands to another. And when a desperate gambler with a hard face and mean eyes finally offered her up as payment for his debt, the crowd reacted the way crowds often do when conscience fails. A few gasped, a few turned away, but many laughed. That laughter rolled across the street like a sickness. Caleb stood near the back at first, broad-shouldered and still, his hat pulled low, the kind of man people noticed only after he had already been standing there for some time. He had not come to watch a spectacle. He had come for feed, lamp oil, and the kind of ordinary tasks that help a man survive one more day when surviving is the only thing left. His farm sat beyond the edge of town where the wind had its way with the land, and the earth yielded only to stubborn hands. Once, years earlier, there had been warmth in that home. Once there had been laughter at his table, small footsteps on the porch, a woman singing softly as evening settled over the fields. But grief is a patient thief. It takes what it wants and leaves the house standing so you can feel the emptiness of every room. Caleb had buried his wife. Caleb had buried his son, and after that, something in him had gone quiet in a way that frightened even those who loved him. So when he saw the woman standing there, head lowered as men argued over her like livestock, he should have kept walking. That is what any sensible man would have done. He had no place in this matter, no strength for another sorrow, no reason to invite trouble into a life already hollowed out by pain. And yet he did not move. His eyes found hers for only a moment, but it was enough. There was fear in that face. Yes, shame too. But beneath both was something that did not belong to a defeated person. Something watchful, something guarded, something alive. Have you ever looked into a stranger's eyes and felt, without understanding why, that their life is standing on the edge of a cliff and somehow your own is standing there with it? The man claiming ownership of her barked out the rules with the rough confidence of someone certain the world could be bought. He wanted his debt cleared. Another man scoffed that she was not worth the money. Another tossed in a joke ugly enough to make decent people stare at the ground. Then came the offer, careless and cruel, as though the matter were no different than trading a horse with a limp. No one stepped forward. No one with honor. No one with courage. Only the sound of shifting boots and low laughter. The woman never spoke. She just stood there, hands clasped so tightly in front of her that even from a distance, Caleb could see the strain in her fingers. Then he heard himself speak. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Caleb had the kind of voice that carried because it came from somewhere deep and settled. The crowd turned. The laughter thinned. He stepped forward slowly, every eye on him now, and named a price enough to silence the street. Some thought he was making a joke. Some waited for him to grin and step back. But Caleb did neither. He took the folded bills from his coat and held them out with a hand that did not shake. The gambler stared at him as if trying to decide whether grief had made him soft in the head. Around them, whispers began to spread like brushfire. Why would he do this? What does he want with her? Has he lost his senses? And perhaps the cruelest whisper of all, he won himself a wife. But Caleb was not looking at them. He was looking at her. For the first time, she raised her eyes fully to meet his. The crowd expected relief, gratitude, maybe tears. They got none of that. What they saw was disbelief. Not the disbelief of someone rescued, but of someone who has been hurt too many times to trust rescue when it appears. Her face remained pale and still, yet something trembled beneath the surface. A question, a warning, a quiet refusal to hope too soon. Caleb understood that look more than anyone there knew. When life has taken enough from you, kindness can feel more frightening than cruelty. Cruelty makes sense. Kindness asks you to believe again. As the money changed hands, the laughter returned. Thinner now, edged with discomfort. Men muttered that he was a fool. Women watched from porches with unreadable faces. One old rancher spat in the dirt and said Caleb Mercer had just yoked himself to trouble. Maybe he had. Maybe the whole town was right. Because the truth is, a lonely man can mistake mercy for redemption. A broken heart can reach for one final purpose and call it strength. So what was this? Really? Was Caleb saving her? Or was he trying to save the last human part of himself before it disappeared for good? That is the question at the center of everything that followed. And maybe it is the question that matters most. When a man with nothing left risks what little remains. Is that courage? Or is it desperation in its most honest form? He offered her his coat when the wind sharpened. She hesitated before taking it. Even then, even in that moment when the whole town had seen her reduced and humiliated, she protected herself with silence. He did not press her. He simply turned toward the road leading out of town and waited. After a long moment, she followed. Behind them, the whispers grew louder. Some laughed openly now, emboldened by distance. Some predicted disaster before sundown. Some said Caleb would regret this before the week was through. He did not answer any of them. He kept walking. The road home stretched ahead in a ribbon of dust and fading light. Beside him walked a woman no one seemed to want. A woman with no reason to trust him. No reason to speak. No reason to believe that this road led anywhere except another kind of suffering. And still she walked. That was the first sign that she was not what they said. Broken people often stop moving long before their bodies do. But there was endurance in her. A stubbornness. A hidden center that had not yet surrendered. Caleb noticed it without knowing why it mattered. He noticed the way she kept glancing at the ground as if memorizing the shape of the earth. He noticed the way she listened to the wind through the dry grass. He noticed, above all, that the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt waiting, like land before rain, like a seed under hard soil, like something the world had called dead, though it was only buried. And if you had seen them then, just two lonely figures moving toward a farmhouse under the falling evening, you might have believed this was the beginning of a simple story. A sad man, a frightened woman, a cruel town left behind. But this was never going to be a simple story, because the woman Caleb took home was carrying far more than fear, and the land he was bringing her to was carrying far more than drought. One hidden truth would soon begin to change them both. One choice made in a moment of pity would become a test of honor, sacrifice, and love. So before we go any further, ask yourself this. If the world mocked you for doing the decent thing, would you still do it? And if a stranger placed their broken future in your hands, would you know how to carry it? That night, as the last light drained from the sky, and the town's laughter faded into distance. Caleb Mercer walked beside the woman they said was worthless and led her toward the only thing he had left to offer: a home full of ghosts, a table with one chair too many, a piece of dying land, and a heart he believed had nothing left to give. He did not know that before this story was over. All of it would be tested: his name, his courage, his willingness to stand against men more powerful than himself, even his readiness to lose one more thing he loved. He only knew that he could not leave her there. Sometimes that is how the biggest stories begin. Not with certainty, not with triumph, just with one wounded soul refusing to abandon another. Caleb Mercer was not a man people turned to for stories anymore. Once, long ago, he had been known as steady, dependable, the kind of man who built things that lasted and kept his word even when it cost him. But time and loss have a way of reshaping a man's place in the world. By the time this story begins, Caleb had become something else entirely. Not feared, not respected in the way he once was. Simply forgotten. A man who moved through life quietly enough that others could pretend his pain did not exist. His land sat far beyond the edges of town, where the soil had turned stubborn and the wind carried more dust than promise. It was the kind of place only someone with nothing left would choose to hold on to, and Caleb held on to it with a kind of quiet defiance that no one fully understood. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was memory, or maybe it was the last piece of a life that had once made sense. As they walked that long road under the fading light, Eleanor kept a careful distance from him. Not too far, not too close. Enough to follow, but not enough to trust. Caleb noticed, but he did not comment. He had learned, through his own grief, that some silences must be respected. Words, when offered too early, can feel like pressure, and pressure can break what little strength a person has left. The sky darkened slowly, turning from gray to deep blue, and the first stars began to show themselves one by one. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant grass. It had been years since Caleb had walked beside someone like this. Not a neighbor, not a passing stranger, but someone whose presence followed him, step for step, into the quiet of his world. It stirred something uneasy inside him. Not comfort, not yet. Something closer to awareness, like waking up in a room you thought was empty. Have you ever lived so long with silence that even the sound of another person breathing nearby feels unfamiliar? They reached the farmhouse just as darkness settled fully over the land. It stood the way it always had, strong, but worn. The wood faded from years of sun and wind. The porch slightly uneven. The windows clean, though rarely opened. Caleb paused for a moment before stepping up. Not because he doubted his decision, but because crossing that threshold with someone else again felt heavier than he expected. Inside, the house carried the quiet weight of memory. Everything was in its place, but nothing felt alive. A chair that had not been moved in years. A table that had once held laughter. A small wooden toy tucked near the corner, left untouched. Caleb did not look at it. He had learned not to. Eleanor stepped in slowly, her eyes moving across the room, taking in every detail with careful attention. Not curiosity, not comfort. Assessment, like someone who had learned to read spaces before trusting them. She did not ask questions. She did not speak at all. She simply stood there, waiting for something or someone to prove itself safe. Caleb set his hat down and moved toward the small stove, lighting it with practiced hands. The flame caught quickly, casting a warm glow that pushed back the cold edges of the room. He gestured toward the chair across from the table, not forcing, just offering. After a moment, she sat. That first night, they shared a meal in silence. Simple food, bread, stew, water, nothing more. Caleb kept his movement steady, predictable, giving her no reason to feel threatened. He did not watch her too closely. He did not ask her name. He did not demand anything in return for what he had done. To anyone else, it might have seemed distant, But in truth, it was the only kind of kindness Caleb knew how to offer anymore. A kindness without expectation. Eleanor ate slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether the moment would last. As if waiting for something to change, something to be taken back, but nothing did. The fire burned steadily, the night remained quiet, and Caleb did not turn into the kind of man she had known before. When the meal ended, he stood and walked to the far side of the house, opening a small door to a spare room. It had not been used in years, but it was clean. He had kept it that way, though he never admitted why. Maybe some part of him had refused to believe that his life would remain empty forever. Or maybe he had simply been unwilling to let every space in his home become a reminder of loss. He stepped aside, giving her room to enter. She hesitated at the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the frame. Then, slowly, she walked inside. Caleb placed a folded blanket on the bed and turned away without a word. That was all. No questions, no explanations, no claim over her, just a place to sleep. Later that night, Caleb sat alone at the table, the fire now low, the house quiet again. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt the same. It was no longer empty. It held another presence, another life, another story that had entered his without permission and without warning. He leaned back slightly, his eyes resting on the dim glow of the fire. For years, he had lived without asking himself certain questions. It was easier that way, easier to wake, work, eat, and sleep without thinking too deeply about what had been lost. But now, those questions began to return. Why did I do it? The answer did not come easily. It would have been simple to say it was the right thing, that any decent man would have stepped forward, but Caleb knew better. Most had not. Most had looked away. Most had chosen comfort over courage. So why him? Was it guilt? The kind that comes from surviving when others do not? Was it loneliness? The kind that grows so heavy it begins to shape your choices without you realizing it? Or was it something else entirely? Something quieter, something that had not fully died, even after everything he had lost. The truth is, sometimes a man does not act because he is strong. Sometimes he acts because he cannot bear one more moment of standing still while something wrong unfolds in front of him. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, the memory of the town's laughter still echoing faintly in his mind. It did not anger him the way it might have once. It simply confirmed what he had already known, that the world could be cold, that people could be cruel, that dignity, once taken, is rarely returned without a fight. But there was something else now, something he had not felt in a long time. Responsibility, not the kind tied to duty or obligation, but something deeper, something personal. He had brought her here. Whatever happened next was now his to face. In the quiet of that night, another thought surfaced, one he did not fully understand yet. What if she was not the one being saved? What if, without meaning to, he had just stepped into the one thing that might change him? In the other room, Eleanor lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the unfamiliar space pressing in around her. She listened carefully to every sound, the shifting of wood, the wind outside, the faint movement from the other room where Caleb sat. Her body remained tense, ready, unwilling to surrender, to rest too quickly, because trust, for her, was not something given. It was something tested, and this was only the beginning. So let me ask you something. If you had nothing left, no family, no future, no reason to hope, and one unexpected choice placed another life into your hands, would you carry that weight, or would you wish you had walked away? Because Caleb Mercer no longer had the option to wonder. He had already chosen, and that choice was about to change everything. In the days that followed, the town's laughter did not reach Caleb's land, but its echo lingered in quieter ways. It lived in memory, in habit, in the way a man expects disappointment before anything else. Out here, there were no crowds, no whispers, no cruel jokes carried on the wind, only distance. Only work. Only time. And time, as it turned out, would begin to reveal something neither of them expected. Eleanor remained quiet, not just reserved, not simply shy, quiet in a way that felt deliberate, measured, as though every word she chose not to speak was protecting something beneath the surface. Caleb did not press her. He had long ago learned that forcing truth from someone only drives it deeper into hiding. Instead, he gave her space. Space to move. Space to observe. Space to decide whether this place was a refuge or just another kind of cage. Each morning began the same way. Caleb rose before sunrise, as he always had. The land demanded it. There were fences to check, tools to maintain, soil that needed turning even when it refused to yield. It was hard, thankless work, the kind that wears down a man slowly, day after day, until effort and survival become the same thing. At first, Eleanor stayed inside, watching, listening, learning the rhythm of a life she had not chosen. But Caleb noticed something early on. She did not move like someone defeated. She moved carefully. Yes, but not weakly. There was intention in the way she touched things, in the way her eyes lingered on details most people ignored. She paid attention to the ground outside the house, to the way the wind shifted through the fields, to the dryness of the soil between her fingers. And sometimes, she would look out toward the land, not with fear, but with thought. Have you ever seen someone study something the world has already given up on, as if they know a secret it does not? On the third morning, Caleb found her standing just beyond the porch, her bare feet pressed into the dirt. She did not notice him at first. She was crouched low, her hand brushing lightly across the surface of the soil, then digging slightly deeper, feeling the texture, the resistance. He said nothing. He simply watched. After a moment, she stood, brushing her hands against her dress. When she turned and saw him, there was a brief flicker of something in her expression. Not fear this time, not quite. Something closer to being caught, not doing something wrong, but doing something private. Still, she said nothing, and neither did he. That became their pattern. Silence, but not emptiness. Distance, but not indifference. At meals, they sat across from each other, the quiet no longer as heavy as that first night. Caleb would sometimes leave small things on the table, an extra piece of bread, a cup already filled. Not gestures meant to impress, just simple acknowledgments that she was there, that she mattered, even if neither of them spoke the words. And slowly, very slowly, something began to shift. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the dry land in fading gold, Eleanor stepped outside again. This time, Caleb was already working near the edge of the field, repairing a broken fence post. She approached, not directly, but close enough to be seen. He glanced up briefly, then returned to his work. It was a small thing, but it mattered. He did not stare. He did not question. He did not demand her presence. He allowed it. After a few minutes, she moved closer, then closer still, until she stood just a few feet away. Her eyes followed his hands as he worked. The steady rhythm, the careful pressure, the way he handled each task with quiet patience. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain, as if unused. The soil here, it is not dead. Caleb paused, not because of what she said, but because she had spoken at all. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time not as someone he had brought home, but as someone who had chosen to step forward. Not dead, he repeated. No. She shook her head slightly, her gaze shifting toward the field. It is tired, stripped, but not dead. Caleb let that settle. Most people would have dismissed it. The land had been failing for years. Crops barely grew. Rain came too little, too late. Men smarter than him had walked away from better soil than this. And yet, something in the way she said it did not sound like hope. It sounded like certainty. He leaned back slightly against the post, studying her now with quiet curiosity. "You know, land?" he said, a simple statement. She hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. A little. It was not much, but it was more than she had given before. And in that moment, something changed. Not in the land, not yet, but in the way Caleb saw her, because the woman the town had called worthless was looking at his dying fields and seeing something else entirely. Over the next few days, her presence outside became more frequent. She did not intrude, she did not take over, but she observed, always observing, sometimes kneeling to examine the soil, sometimes watching how water settled after a rare morning dew, sometimes simply standing still, as if listening to something beneath the surface. Caleb found himself watching her in return, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of curiosity he had not felt in years. "Who are you?" He did not ask it out loud. Not yet, because he understood something now. Whatever she was carrying, whatever truth lay beneath her silence, it was not something she would give easily, and maybe it was not something he was ready to hear. But the question remained, stronger each day. Because people do not look at broken things the way she did, unless they understand something others do not, unless they have seen life return where no one believed it could, unless they are hiding more than fear. So let me ask you this. When someone the world has discarded begins to reveal something unexpected, do you lean closer or do you step back? Because Caleb Mercer, without realizing it yet, had already begun to lean in. And whatever Eleanor was hiding was not going to stay hidden for long. The first sign of change was not dramatic. There was no sudden warmth, no music swelling in the background of their lives, no moment where two broken people looked at each other and understood everything at once. That is not how real connection begins. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, like the first hint of moisture in dry soil. Easy to miss, unless you are paying attention, and neither of them would admit it. But they were. The mornings grew less distant. Eleanor no longer stayed inside. She began stepping out earlier, sometimes before Caleb had even finished preparing for the day. At first, she kept her distance, walking along the edges of the land, observing as she always had. But now, there was a subtle difference. She was no longer just watching. She was learning the rhythm of his work, and slowly, she began to match it. One morning, Caleb returned from checking the far fence line to find a small stack of tools arranged neatly beside the shed. Not randomly placed, not guessed. Organized in a way that suggested understanding. He paused, studying them for a moment. He had not told her where anything belonged. He had not asked for help. Still, there they were, a small thing, but out here, small things mattered. Inside the house, the changes were just as quiet. A cup filled before he sat down. Bread set closer to his side of the table. The fire started just a little earlier in the evening. No words exchanged. No acknowledgement. Just presence. Care. Without announcement. Have you ever noticed how the smallest acts can carry the greatest meaning? When no one is asking for recognition, Caleb did not thank her. Not because he didn't notice, but because he understood something important. If he named it too soon, it might disappear. So instead, he responded in the only way he knew how. One evening, as the air turned colder and the wind began to pick up across the fields, he returned from work carrying an extra coat. He did not hand it to her directly. He simply placed it on the chair beside where she usually sat. She saw it. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she took it. That was all. But something passed between them in that moment. Not spoken, not defined, but understood. A quiet agreement. "I see you." And for the first time since she had arrived, Eleanor did not seem like someone waiting for something to be taken away. She seemed present. Days turned into a pattern neither of them questioned. Work in the morning, small shared tasks in the afternoon, quiet meals in the evening, and always that silence between them. But the silence had changed. It was no longer guarded. It was steady. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and the dry wind softened just enough to make the air feel almost forgiving, Caleb was working near the center of the field, turning soil that had resisted him for years. Eleanor approached again, this time without hesitation. She crouched beside him, her hands moving through the dirt with careful attention. "Too compact," she said softly. Caleb paused, leaning on his tool. He looked down at the soil, then back at her. "It has always been that way," he replied. She shook her head slightly. "Not always." Her fingers pressed deeper, breaking apart the hardened surface. "It can change." There it was again. Not hope. Certainty. Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You speak like you have seen it before." Another pause. Longer this time. Then she nodded. "I have." That answer settled into the space between them, heavier than anything she had said so far, because now it was no longer just observation. It was experience. And with experience comes a story. But she did not offer it. Not yet. Instead, she stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, and stepped back slightly, as if she had already said too much. Caleb could have asked more. He could have pressed, demanded, but he didn't, because something in her still held back, and he understood that pushing against that would only rebuild the walls she had just begun to lower. So he returned to his work, and she stayed, not watching this time, helping. It started awkwardly, uncoordinated movements, small mistakes, but neither of them acknowledged it. They adjusted, quietly, naturally, until, without either of them noticing the exact moment it happened, they were working together, not as strangers, not as obligation, but as something else, something forming. As the days passed, those small moments began to add up. A shared glance when something went right, a brief pause when something didn't. The kind of unspoken communication that only grows when two people begin to trust not just each other, but the space between them. And then, one evening, something shifted again. They were sitting at the table, the fire low, the room filled with that familiar quiet. Caleb reached for the bread, but stopped when he noticed something unusual. Eleanor was watching him, not cautiously, not defensively, just watching. He met her gaze. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Then, very softly, she spoke. "Why did you do it?" The question lingered in the air. Simple, direct, but carrying the weight of everything that had come before. Caleb leaned back slightly. Considering it, he could have given her an easy answer. The right thing, the decent thing, but something about the way she asked told him she would know the difference. So he told the truth. "I could not leave you there." Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes did. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before returning to hers. "Because I know what it looks like when no one comes." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full of understanding. Because for the first time, they were no longer just two people sharing space. They were two people recognizing something in each other. Loss, abandonment, survival, and maybe something else beginning to take root beneath all of it. Eleanor looked down at her hands, her voice quieter now. "I did not think anyone would." Caleb nodded once. "Neither did I." Another silence. But this one was different. Softer, warmer, like something fragile had been placed between them, and neither wanted to disturb it. That night, as the wind moved gently across the land and the house settled into its quiet rhythm, something had undeniably changed. Not love, not yet, but the distance between them had closed, and in its place, something real had begun. So let me ask you this. Can two people, shaped by loss and silence, truly find their way back to trust? Or are some wounds too deep to ever allow it? Because what was growing between Caleb and Eleanor was not built on words. It was built on something far more fragile and far more powerful. The choice to stay, even when leaving would be easier, The truth did not come all at once. It never does. Secrets that have been carried too long do not unfold like stories told around a fire. They surface in fragments, in hesitation, in moments where silence becomes heavier than speaking. And for Eleanor, that weight had been building quietly, day by day, as the distance between her and Caleb slowly disappeared. It began in the field, the same field most men had already given up on, the same land Caleb had fought for years, only to watch it yield less and less with each passing season. That morning, the sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain that might never come. Caleb stood near the center of the land, his boots pressing into the dry earth as he studied it the way he always had. With effort, with stubbornness, with a kind of quiet refusal to surrender, Eleanor stood a few steps away, watching, but this time, something was different. She was not observing. She was deciding. Have you ever reached a moment where keeping a secret feels heavier than the risk of revealing it? She moved forward slowly, her hands clasped together for a brief second before she let them fall to her sides. Caleb noticed the shift immediately. He turned toward her, sensing something in the air that had not been there before. Her voice, when it came, was steady. I need to show you something. Not ask, not suggest. Show. Caleb did not respond right away. He simply nodded once, stepping back slightly, giving her the space she seemed to need. Eleanor knelt down and pressed her hands into the soil. Deeper this time, not just brushing the surface, digging, feeling, breaking through the hardened layer with deliberate care. She moved slowly, methodically, as if following a pattern only she could see. Then she looked up. The problem is not the soil itself, she said. It is what has been taken from it. Caleb frowned slightly. Taken. She nodded. Nutrients. Structure. Balance. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Not guesswork. Not hope. Knowledge. He stepped closer now, crouching beside her. And you know how to bring it back. It was not a question. It was recognition. Eleanor hesitated. For the first time since she had arrived, real conflict appeared in her expression. Not fear of him, not fear of the land, fear of being known, because once truth is spoken, it cannot be taken back. Finally, she exhaled softly. Yes, the word hung between them, and with it, everything began to change. Caleb sat back slightly, studying her more carefully now, not as someone he had helped, but as someone he did not fully understand. Who taught you that? A long pause. Then, quietly, my father. The words landed heavier than anything she had said before, because they opened a door, and behind that door was a story she had kept buried. He worked with land. She continued. Not farming, not the way most people do. He studied it, understood how it lives, how it breaks, how it can heal. Her eyes dropped briefly to the soil beneath her hands. He said the earth is like people. If you strip it long enough, it stops giving. But if you understand what it needs, it can come back. Caleb listened without interruption, because something in her voice had changed. It was no longer guarded. It was personal. Why did you not say anything before? The question came gently. No accusation. Just truth. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly in the dirt, because no one ever listened. There it was. Not anger, not bitterness, just a simple, painful fact. The town had not seen her. They had judged her, dismissed her, reduced her to something less than she was. And in doing so, they had missed everything that mattered. Caleb let out a slow breath, his gaze moving across the land. If what you are saying is true, he stopped. Not because he doubted her, but because the weight of it was beginning to settle. This land could change. His life could change. Everything he had fought against for years might not be lost after all. He looked back at her. Show me. It was the first time he had asked something of her, and it mattered. Eleanor studied his face carefully, as if searching for doubt, for hesitation, For the same dismissal she had seen so many times before, but it was not there, only quiet trust. And something else, respect. She nodded once, then reached for his hand, not in comfort, not in affection, but in guidance. She placed his hand into the soil beside hers, pressing it deeper. Feel it. Caleb frowned slightly, but followed her lead. It feels the same. She shook her head. No, wait. He stilled his hand, letting it settle, and then, slowly, he noticed it. Rupperted, 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 rupperted. Beneath the hard surface, something softer, something different, not dead, just buried. Eleanor watched his expression carefully. You see, Caleb did not answer right away, because what he was feeling was not just soil. It was possibility, and possibility is a dangerous thing for a man who has learned not to hope. If this works, he stopped again, because the thought felt too large to say out loud. Eleanor finished it for him. It will not just change the land. It will change everything. Silence followed, but this silence was not uncertain. It was full, because for the first time since they had met, they were not just surviving, they were building something. Together, over the next few days, everything shifted. Eleanor no longer held back. She worked beside him, guiding, explaining in small pieces, never overwhelming, always precise. She showed him how to break the soil differently, how to restore what had been lost instead of forcing what remained, how to listen to the land instead of fighting it. And slowly, the land responded, not in miracles, not in sudden transformation, but in signs, subtle changes. The way the soil held moisture just a little longer, the way the ground broke more easily beneath their hands, the way something that had felt lifeless began to feel possible again. Caleb noticed every detail, because for the first time in years, his work did not feel like resistance. It felt like progress. And Eleanor, she changed too. The fear in her movements faded. The hesitation in her voice softened. She spoke more now. Not much, but enough. Enough for Caleb to see who she really was. Not broken, not worthless, but someone who had been unseen for far too long. And in that quiet transformation, something deeper began to take root. Because the woman the world had dismissed was becoming the reason Caleb's world might survive. So let me ask you this. How many times has the world been saved by someone it refused to see? Because what Caleb Mercer was beginning to understand was that he had not brought home a burden, he had brought home a turning point. And the life he thought was over was just beginning to grow again. The change did not come like a storm. It came like rain that no one expected, soft at first, quiet, easy to overlook if you were not paying attention, but steady enough that, over time, it began to sink into everything. The land was the first to show it. Where the soil had once cracked under the weight of heat and neglect, it now loosened, not fully, not yet, but enough that Caleb could feel the difference with every strike of his tool. The resistance was still there, but it no longer felt like refusal. It felt like something giving way, and beside him, Eleanor worked with a calm certainty that no longer wavered. She moved through the field as if she understood it on a deeper level, not controlling it, not forcing it, listening to it, adjusting, guiding. And Caleb, for the first time in years, found himself doing something he had not done since before everything was taken from him. He trusted someone else with his future. Have you ever reached a point where trusting again feels more dangerous than losing everything? Because for Caleb, that was exactly where he stood. But still, he chose to stay. Days turned into weeks. Their rhythm became something natural, something unspoken. They rose early, worked side by side, shared meals without ceremony, and rested under the same quiet roof that no longer felt as empty as it once had. And somewhere in the middle of all that, something began to grow that had nothing to do with the land. It was in the small things. The way Eleanor would pause to wait for him when the ground grew uneven. The way Caleb would leave water where she could reach it without asking. The way their silence no longer needed explanation. The way their eyes would meet and hold just a second longer than before. Not forced, not planned, just happening. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat outside on the porch. Watching the sun settle low over the horizon, the sky stretched wide and endless, painted in soft shades of gold and fading blue. The wind had calmed, leaving the air still in a way that felt rare for that place. Eleanor sat with her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the land. "It is changing," she said quietly. Caleb nodded. "I can see it." She glanced at him then. Not just the land. He did not respond right away, because he understood what she meant. The land was not the only thing beginning to heal. After a moment, he exhaled softly. "Neither are we." The words settled between them, gentle but undeniable. Eleanor looked back toward the horizon, her expression softer than it had ever been. "For a long time, I did not think that was possible." Caleb's gaze followed hers. "I did not either." Silence returned, but it was no longer something they hid behind. It was something they shared, and in that shared silence, something deeper took hold. Not sudden, not overwhelming, but real, like roots growing beneath the surface. Unseen but strong. Later that night, as the house settled into its quiet, Caleb found himself lingering by the doorway of the spare room. The light inside was dim, the soft glow of a small lamp casting shadows across the walls. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded loosely, her posture no longer tense, no longer guarded. She looked up when she noticed him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb stepped slightly closer. "You do not have to stay in that room." The words came carefully, not as an expectation, not as a demand, just an offering. Eleanor held his gaze. There was no fear there now, only thought. After a moment, she stood, not quickly, not hesitantly, just with quiet certainty, and she stepped past him into the hallway. That was all. No declaration, no explanation, but everything changed. Because that night, the distance between them finally disappeared. Not in a rush, not in a way that would break what they had built, but in a way that felt earned. Over the days that followed, the connection between them deepened in ways neither had expected. They spoke more now, not endlessly, not about everything, but enough to begin understanding the shape of each other's past. Caleb told her about his wife, about his son, not every detail, but enough for Eleanor to see the man he had been before grief had taken its place. And Eleanor, slowly, told him more about her father, about the work, about the knowledge she carried, about the way it had been dismissed, ignored, until it no longer felt worth sharing. And through those conversations, something else began to grow. Respect, not just for what they had survived, but for who they were. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in a part of the field that had once refused to yield anything at all, Caleb paused and leaned on his tool. Watching her for a moment, "You changed this," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "We did." He studied her carefully. "No, you showed me how." She met his gaze, and you chose to believe it. Another silence. But this one carried something new, something undeniable, because belief, when shared, becomes something stronger than either person alone. And in that moment, the truth became clear. This was no longer about survival. This was no longer about filling empty space. This was something else entirely. Something that neither of them had planned. Something neither of them had believed they would find again. Love. Not loud, not sudden, but steady, deep, unshakable, like the land beneath their feet, finally coming back to life. So let me ask you this. Can love grow in the same place where everything once fell apart? Or does it need something more? Because for Caleb and Eleanor, love did not arrive despite the brokenness. It grew from it. And just as the land began to respond to their care, their hearts began to respond to each other. But as with anything worth having, what begins in peace will always be tested. And far beyond the quiet edges of their land, someone had begun to notice the change. And not everyone was willing to let it continue. Change, no matter how quiet, does not stay hidden forever. Not in a place like that. Not in a world where power watches closely. And anything valuable is eventually claimed. At first, it was just whispers. A trader passing through town mentioned that Caleb Mercer's land looked different. Not green, not thriving, but alive in a way it had not been for years. Another man claimed he had seen rows forming where nothing had grown before. A third dismissed it as luck. A fourth called it impossible. But impossible things tend to draw the most attention. And attention draws the wrong kind of interest. His name was Dalton Hayes, a man who did not raise his voice because he never needed to. A man whose authority came not from respect, but from control. He owned more land than anyone in the region, though most of it sat unused, not because he lacked the knowledge to make it grow, but because he understood something far more valuable. Ownership is not about what you build. It is about what you keep others from having. Dalton had built his influence slowly, through debts, through pressure, through quiet agreements that left men with fewer choices each year. By the time most realized what they had lost, it was already too late. And now, something new had reached his ears. A failing piece of land, beginning to recover. A man who should have remained broken, rebuilding, and more importantly, a woman, unknown, unclaimed, and suddenly, valuable. Have you ever noticed how quickly the world changes its mind when something once ignored becomes useful? Dalton did not rush. Men like him never do. He waited, watched, listened, until he was certain. Then one morning, without warning, a rider appeared at the edge of Caleb's land. Caleb saw him first. A figure against the horizon, still, patient, not announcing himself, just waiting to be noticed. Eleanor was working a few yards away, her hands deep in the soil, her focus steady. Caleb set down his tool slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the man. Something about the way he sat there, too calm, too certain. It did not feel like a neighbor. It felt like a message. He walked toward the edge of the field, his steps measured, his posture steady. The rider did not move until Caleb was close enough to hear him clearly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice smooth, controlled. "You have been busy." Caleb did not respond immediately, just looked, taking in every detail, well-dressed, too clean for someone who worked the land. This was not a man who built, this was a man who owned. "What do you want?" Direct, no courtesy. Dalton smiled faintly. Straight to the point. "I respect that." His gaze shifted briefly across the field, then toward the house, then back to Caleb. "Word travels. It seems your land has found new life." Caleb remained still. "Land changes," he said. "Sometimes." Dalton's smile did not fade. "Not like this." A pause. Then, more deliberate now, and not without reason. The air shifted, subtle, but undeniable. Because now, they were no longer talking about land. They were talking about something else. Caleb's voice hardened slightly. "Say what you came to say." Dalton studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well." He leaned forward slightly in his saddle. The woman, Caleb's expression did not change, but something inside him tightened. "What about her?" Dalton's tone remained calm. "She does not belong here." The words hung in the air, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. Caleb took a slow step forward. "She belongs where she chooses." Dalton's eyes sharpened just slightly. "That is where you are mistaken." A brief silence. "Come," Then, almost casually, "She was never yours to take." There it was. Not a suggestion. A claim. Eleanor had stopped working. She was standing now, her body still, her eyes fixed on the two men at the edge of the field. She could not hear every word, but she understood enough, because she had heard that tone before. Ownership. Control. Decision made without her. Caleb's voice lowered. "I paid for her freedom." Dalton shook his head slowly. "No. You paid a man who had no right to sell her." The words landed heavier than anything before. Because now, this was no longer about rumor, it was about law, about power, about who had the authority to decide. Dalton straightened slightly. "Her father worked for me." The ground beneath everything shifted. And suddenly, the past was no longer buried. When he died, his work became mine. His property became mine. His responsibilities. His voice softened, but the meaning grew sharper. And his daughter? Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly at her sides. Not from fear alone. From recognition. Because the past she had tried to leave behind had just found her again. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She is not property." Dalton's expression did not change. "Everything is, to the right man." A long pause. Then, calmly, "I will give you time. Not much, but enough to make the right decision." His gaze shifted once more toward Eleanor. "This is not a request." And with that, he turned his horse. No anger, no raised voice, just certainty. Because men like Dalton never needed to force anything immediately. They simply made sure you understood. That resistance had a cost. As the rider disappeared into the distance, the silence he left behind felt heavier than any words. Caleb stood still for a long moment, then turned. Eleanor had not moved. Their eyes met, and for the first time since she had arrived, fear had returned. Not the quiet fear of uncertainty, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly what is coming next. Caleb stepped toward her. He did not rush. He did not speak right away, because he understood something now. This was no longer just about them. This was a fight, and not the kind that could be avoided. Eleanor's voice came softly. "He will not stop." Caleb shook his head. "No." Another pause. Then, firmer now, "Neither will I." But the truth was, this was no longer about rebuilding land. This was no longer about healing. This was something else entirely. A line had been drawn, and everything they had built was now at risk of being taken. So let me ask you this. When love finally gives you something worth protecting, how far are you willing to go to keep it? Because Caleb Mercer was about to find out. And this time, walking away was no longer an option. The moment Dalton left, the land felt different. Nothing had changed in the soil. The wind still moved the same way across the fields. The sky remained wide and indifferent above them. And yet, something had shifted. Something unseen, but deeply felt. Because peace, once threatened, never returns the same. Caleb stood still for a long time after the rider disappeared beyond the horizon. Not out of hesitation, not out of fear, but because he understood the weight of what had just begun. This was not a passing conflict. This was a man with power, making a claim. And men like that did not forget. Behind him, Eleanor had not moved. Her eyes remained fixed in the distance long after Dalton was gone, as if part of her was still standing in that moment, still hearing his voice, still feeling the past closing in around her. Caleb turned slowly and walked back toward her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to reach her, far enough to give her space. "You knew him," he said quietly. It was not a question. Eleanor's breath was shallow, her hands still slightly trembling at her sides. Yes, the word came without resistance, because there was no point in hiding it now. Caleb nodded once. "Tell me." Another long silence, the kind that stretches because it carries more than just words. Then, slowly, she spoke. "My father worked for him," she said. "Not by choice. Not really. He believed in his work, but Dalton believed in control. Her eyes lowered briefly. He funded the research, gave my father land, tools, everything he needed. Caleb listened carefully, and in return, Eleanor's voice tightened slightly. Everything belonged to him. There it was again. Ownership, the same word Dalton had used, but now it carried history, not just threat, truth. My father tried to keep his work independent. She continued, but Dalton always found a way to claim more. To take more? Her hands clenched slightly. When my father died, there was no one left to protect it. Or me. Caleb felt something settle heavily in his chest. Not just anger, understanding. Because he had seen men like Dalton before, men who did not need to raise their voice. Because the world had already bent in their direction. And now, that world was reaching into his... He looked at her steadily. Why did you not tell me? Eleanor met his gaze. Because it would not have changed anything. A pause. Then, softer. And because I did not want you to look at me the way they did. Caleb's expression did not shift. I do not. The answer came without hesitation. And for a moment, the tension in her shoulders eased. But only slightly. Because the truth was now out. And with it, the danger. Caleb turned his gaze toward the house. Then back across the land they had worked so hard to restore. If what he says is true, he did not finish. He did not need to. Because the question was already there. What happens next? Eleanor's voice was quiet, but certain. He will come back. And next time, he will not come alone. The wind moved again across the field, brushing through the soil that had just begun to soften. Caleb took a slow breath, then nodded. All right. The word was simple, but it carried something new. Decision. He stepped closer now, his voice lower. Steadier. Then we do not wait. Eleanor frowned slightly. What do you mean? Caleb's eyes hardened just enough to show what he was thinking. I mean, we find a way to stop him. The words hung in the air, not reckless, not desperate, deliberate. Because for the first time in years, Caleb was not reacting, he was choosing. Have you ever reached a moment where you realize that if you do nothing, you will lose everything anyway? Eleanor studied him carefully. He has power, she said. Land, money, influence. People who will do what he says without question. Caleb nodded. I know. Then how do you fight that? A long pause, because that was the question. Not just how to stand against a man like Dalton, but how to win. Caleb looked back toward the horizon, his mind already moving through possibilities, through risks, through the kind of choices he had not made in years. You said your father's work mattered to him. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, then that is where we start. She hesitated. You think proof will stop him? Caleb shook his head. No. Another pause. Then, more quietly, but it might stop everyone else from standing with him. The idea settled between them. Not complete, not certain, but something. Because power does not stand alone. It stands because others allow it to. And if that foundation cracks, even the strongest man can fall. Eleanor looked at him. Something shifting again in her expression. Not fear this time. Not doubt. Something closer to resolve. There are records, she said slowly. My father kept everything. Notes, methods, results. Her voice grew steadier. If we find them, we can prove what Dalton is trying to take. Caleb nodded. Where? A brief hesitation. Then, his old lab. It is not far. But... She stopped. But what? Her eyes met his. Dalton will expect us to go there. Caleb let out a slow breath. Good. The word surprised her. Because instead of fear, there was something else in his voice. Readiness. Then we go anyway. Eleanor searched his face. That is dangerous. Caleb held her gaze. So as waiting, silence followed. But this time, it was not uncertain. It was the kind of silence that comes before action, before a choice is made and cannot be undone. Eleanor nodded. Then we go together. Caleb's expression softened just slightly. Of course, because that was the truth of it now. There was no more distance between them, no more separation of paths. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the land that had just begun to come back to life, Caleb looked out over it one more time. The soil, the work, the change, everything they had built, fragile, but real, and now, at risk. So let me ask you this. When everything you have rebuilt stands on the edge of being taken, do you protect it, or do you fight for it? Because Caleb Mercer had already made his choice. And by the time the sun rose again, there would be no turning back. The courtroom was smaller than most expected. Not grand, not imposing. Just a simple room built to hold decisions that would change lives whether the walls were worthy of it or not. Wooden benches lined the space, worn from years of quiet tension. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor as if even the light itself hesitated to fully enter. But on that day, every seat was filled, because word had spread, not just about the land, not just about the woman, but about the man who had chosen to stand against something larger than himself. And people always come to watch when they believe a man is about to lose. Caleb stood near the front, his posture steady, his expression unreadable. He wore the same coat he had worn the day he brought Eleanor home. The same quiet presence, the same weight carried in silence. But there was something different now. He was not standing alone. Eleanor stood beside him, not behind, not hidden. Beside, her hands were still, her gaze forward. Her fear no longer visible on the surface, but it was there. Not for herself, but for what this moment could take from both of them. Because today was not just about truth, it was about who the world would choose to believe. Have you ever stood in a place where your entire future depended on whether others could see what you already know to be true? Across the room, Dalton Hayes sat with the ease of a man who had never truly been challenged. His clothes were sharp, his posture relaxed, his confidence untouched. To anyone watching, it would seem as though the outcome had already been decided. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The judge entered quietly, taking his place without ceremony. The room settled, voices faded, and just like that, it began. Dalton's side spoke first. Calm, structured, certain. They presented documents, claims of ownership, agreements signed years ago, records that tied Eleanor's father to Dalton's funding, to his land, to his authority, every word carefully placed. Every detail designed to create one simple conclusion. She belongs to him, not as a person, but as a consequence, as an extension of what he claimed was his. Eleanor listened without moving, because she had heard versions of this before, not in a courtroom, but in every place where her voice had been dismissed, where her identity had been reduced to something someone else could define. Caleb stood beside her, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed forward, waiting, because he knew something Dalton did not. This time, they were not empty-handed. When it was their turn, the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough, because something in Caleb's presence made people lean forward, even if they did not understand why. He was not a man of speeches, not a man of polished words, but he was a man of truth. And sometimes, that carries further than anything else. He stepped forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. She is not his. Caleb said, simple, clear, no decoration. A few murmurs moved through the room. Dalton did not react. Not yet. Caleb continued. You can claim land. You can claim work. You can claim what a man built under your name. He paused. But you do not get to claim a life. Silence followed, because those words did not sound like argument. They sounded like something deeper, something people recognized, even if they had never spoken it themselves. Then Eleanor stepped forward, and that changed everything, because this was the moment she had never been given before. The moment where she would not be spoken for, the moment where she would not be defined by someone else, She held a small bundle of papers in her hands. Worn, carefully kept. Her father's records. The truth he had left behind. My father did not belong to him. She said, her voice steady, clear, and for the first time, strong enough to carry across the room without hesitation. He worked with him, because he had no other choice. She placed the papers down, but his work was his own. The judge leaned forward slightly. The room stilled, because now the foundation was shifting. Eleanor continued. Everything he discovered, everything he built, it is here. Her hand rested lightly on the papers, not as proof alone, but as something more: legacy, truth, identity. Dalton's expression changed for the first time, only slightly, but enough. Because this, he had not expected. The judge examined the documents carefully, flipping through pages filled with notes, diagrams, records of results that spoke not just of knowledge, but of independence. And slowly, the certainty in the room began to crack. But power does not fall quietly. Dalton stood, for the first time, his voice calm, controlled. Even now, these are just papers, he said, unverified. Convenient. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the room. Anyone can write a story. The words landed, because doubt is always the strongest weapon of those who have power. And for a moment, the room wavered, because truth, when challenged, must be defended. Caleb stepped forward again, not with anger, not with desperation, but with something far stronger: conviction. Then come see it, he said. Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. See what? Caleb's voice did not rise. The land. A pause. Then, more firmly, come see what her work does. The room shifted again, because now, this was no longer just about words. It was about proof that could not be argued away. The judge considered, then nodded slowly. And just like that, the trial moved beyond the walls of the courtroom, out into the land, out into reality. Hours later, they stood together in the field, the same land that had once been lifeless, the same soil that had refused to give anything back. And now, it had changed. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably, the ground was softer, stronger, alive in a way it had not been before. The evidence was not written. It was standing beneath their feet. Eleanor stepped forward. This is what he could not control, she said quietly. Not money, not ownership, not fear. She looked directly at Dalton. Life does not belong to anyone. Silence followed, heavy, final, because in that moment, the truth was no longer something that could be questioned. It was something that could be seen. Dalton's control slipped, just enough, and that was all it took. But power, when threatened, becomes dangerous. And as the tension broke, as the outcome began to turn, it happened. Fast, too fast. A sharp sound cut through the air, not loud, but unmistakable. Eleanor froze. Caleb moved. Instinct, nothing else. He stepped in front of her before the moment could even fully register. Then, impact. His body tensed, a breath caught, and suddenly, everything slowed. Eleanor's hands reached for him as he staggered slightly, her eyes wide, her voice breaking in a way it never had before. Caleb. He did not fall immediately. He held himself upright, his gaze still steady, still focused, still protecting, not because he was unhurt, but because in that moment, her safety mattered more than anything else. Have you ever seen a man prove what he feels? Not with words, but with what he is willing to lose. The world around them blurred into motion, voices, shouting, movement. But for Caleb, there was only one thing that mattered: Eleanor's face, her hands holding onto him, her voice calling him back. And in that moment, everything that had once been empty inside him was full again. Not with grief, not with loss, but with something stronger, something worth everything: love. And this time, it was not something he was willing to lose without a fight. For a moment, no one moved. The sound had already faded, but its impact remained, hanging in the air like something the world itself was unwilling to accept. Dust shifted lightly across the ground. The wind carried on as if nothing had happened. And yet, everything had changed. Caleb's body leaned slightly forward, his strength holding for just a second longer than it should have. His eyes never left Eleanor's face. Not fear, not regret, just focus, as if the only thing that mattered was that she was still standing. Then his knees gave. Eleanor caught him before he hit the ground. Her hands, once so steady, now trembled as she lowered him carefully into her arms. Her voice broke, not loud, not panicked, but deeply, painfully real. "Stay with me." It was not a command. It was a plea. Have you ever felt a moment where time slows because your heart refuses to accept what is happening? Around them, the world rushed back into motion. Voices rose. Men shouted. Someone called for help. But all of it felt distant, like noise carried from another place. Because for Eleanor, there was only him. Caleb's breath was shallow, uneven, but still there. His hand moved slightly, finding hers, holding on with what little strength remained. "You are all right," he said quietly. Even now, his first thought was her. Eleanor shook her head, tears slipping down her face. "No, no, you do not get to do that." Her voice trembled, but there was something else beneath it. Refusal. "You do not get to save me and leave me here alone." Caleb's eyes softened. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. Not leaving. The words were barely more than breath, but they were enough, because they carried something stronger than certainty. They carried promise. Time passed, though no one could say how much. Enough for the danger to settle. Enough for truth to take its place. Dalton stood at a distance now, no longer the man in control. His certainty had cracked, his authority slipping away under the weight of what had been revealed. The proof, the witnesses, the truth that could no longer be bent to his will. And this time, there was no silence to protect him, because power only stands as long as others allow it to. The law, slow but steady, began to move. And for the first time, Dalton Hayes was no longer the man deciding outcomes. He was the one facing them. But none of that mattered to Eleanor. Not yet, because the only outcome she cared about was still lying in her arms. Days later, the house felt different again. Not empty, not quiet in the old way, but fragile. Like something precious was being held together one moment at a time. Caleb lay in bed, pale but breathing, the wound bound, the danger not gone, but no longer immediate. The doctor had said little, enough to give hope, not enough to guarantee anything. And so, they waited. Eleanor rarely left his side. The woman who had once trusted no one now refused to let go. She sat beside him through every hour, every change, every breath that came just a little easier than the last. Her hand often rested lightly over his, as if reminding him he was not alone anymore. Have you ever realized that love is not proven in grand moments, but in the quiet decision to stay again and again? One morning, as the first light slipped through the window and touched the edge of the bed, something shifted. Caleb stirred. Small, barely noticeable, but real. Eleanor straightened immediately, her breath catching. Caleb, his eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then finding her. And in that moment, the world returned. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to see her. Enough for her to know he was still here. Relief does not always come as joy. Sometimes it comes as silence, as stillness, as a breath you did not realize you were holding, finally released. Weeks passed, slow healing, careful steps, the kind of recovery that does not rush, because it understands what is at stake. And through it all, the land continued to change. The soil, once hardened and lifeless, now responded to their work, Green began to push through in small, stubborn patches. Not overwhelming, not perfect, but undeniable. Life, returning. Caleb stood at the edge of the field one afternoon, his movements still measured, his strength not fully restored. Eleanor stood beside him, her hand lightly resting against his arm, not holding him up, but ready if he needed it. They looked out over the land together. "It worked," he said quietly. Eleanor shook her head, a soft smile touching her face. "We worked," he glanced at her, and something in that moment felt complete, not finished, but whole, because what they had built was no longer fragile. It had endured. Then, after a long silence, Eleanor took his hand and placed it gently against her stomach. Caleb frowned slightly, confused at first. Then, he understood, and everything changed again. Life, not just in the land, but in them. His expression softened in a way it never had before. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes." No fear, no hesitation, just truth. Caleb let out a slow breath, his hand remaining where it was, as if grounding himself in something he had once believed he would never feel again. A future. The wind moved softly across the field, brushing through the growing rows of green, carrying with it the scent of earth that was no longer dry, no longer empty. Once, that land had been a symbol of loss, of effort without reward, of a life that refused to give anything back. Now, it meant something else. It meant second chances. It meant patience. It meant that even what seems dead can return if given the right care. And for Caleb, it meant something more. It meant he had not been saving her. Not entirely. They had saved each other. So let me ask you this. When life gives you one more chance, after everything has been taken, do you hold on to it? Or do you fear losing it again? Because Caleb Mercer made his choice. He stayed. He believed, he loved, and in the end, the man they once laughed at was the only one who truly understood what it meant to rebuild something worth keeping. The land lived, the family grew, and the silence that once filled that house was finally replaced with something stronger than anything that had been lost. Hope. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. Not every story ends with something grand or perfect, but sometimes a single choice, made in the right moment, is enough to change an entire life. You may not be Caleb, and you may not be Eleanor, but somewhere in your own life, you may have stood at a moment just like that, between walking away or staying, between silence or reaching out to someone who needed to be seen. Life does not always ask us to be strong from the beginning. Sometimes, it simply asks us to be brave enough not to turn away from what is right, even when the world does not understand. And there are moments when what you believe you are giving becomes the very thing that saves you. Because healing does not always come from perfect circumstances. More often, it comes from something simple. Someone who stays. A hand that does not let go. A quiet kind of trust that arrives when we no longer expect it. If today feels heavy, or if you feel like it is too late to begin again, remember this. Some things in life are not truly gone. They are simply waiting to be touched in the right way. And maybe the most beautiful thing is not that life never breaks you, but that, after everything, you still choose to believe. You deserve something better.